Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. She was known among her classmates as someone who never chased attention, even though attention followed her everywhere. Han Se-ren had a kind of presence that made people look twice without knowing why. Teachers praised her discipline, friends trusted her with secrets, strangers assumed she belonged somewhere important. When talent scouts approached her in high school, suggesting auditions and contracts, her friends were convinced she would disappear into television screens and billboards. Han Se-ren smiled politely and declined every time. Fame was loud. Her dream was quiet, steady, and rooted in service. She wanted to wear a uniform. Her father had served briefly in the military years earlier, not as a hero, not as a legend, just as an ordinary man who believed that protecting a country was a responsibility, not a performance. Han Se-ren grew up listening to his stories, not about glory, but about discipline, routine, and camaraderie. To her, the military was not a stage, it was a promise. When she passed the entrance exams and training assessments, earning a position in the Air Defense Command of the Eastern Region, her family celebrated with pride. Han Se-ren was 24, engaged to the man she had dated since university, and convinced that her life was finally aligning with her values. The base was located near the coast, far from the capital, surrounded by pine forests and long stretches of guarded road. It was considered a prestigious assignment, responsible for monitoring airspace and coordinating joint exercises with Allied forces. For a young non-commissioned officer, being assigned there was a mark of trust. On her first day, Han Se-ren stood straighter than she ever had, her uniform crisp, her hair tied back with care. She believed she had earned her place. At first, the environment felt challenging but manageable. The schedule was demanding, the training intense, but she welcomed it. Most of her colleagues were men, many older than her, many who had spent years inside the system. Some were respectful, even encouraging. Others were curious in ways that made her uncomfortable, but seemed harmless enough at the time. Comments about her appearance slipped into conversations. Compliments lingered longer than necessary. She brushed them off, reminding herself that she was here to work, not to be liked. When the remarks continued, she became more reserved. She stopped laughing easily. She avoided casual gatherings. She mentioned her fiancé in conversation, showed photos when asked, hoping it would set a clear boundary. For most people, it did. The atmosphere around her shifted. Some men backed away. Others treated her more formally. She felt relief and believed she had navigated an awkward phase successfully. But there was one man who refused to step back. Kang Min-jae had been stationed at the base for several years. He outranked Se-ren slightly and made sure she noticed it. At first, his behavior hid behind jokes and familiarity. He addressed her by her first name instead of rank. He stood too close during briefings. When she moved, he followed. When she avoided eye contact, he laughed and asked why she was suddenly so cold. She tried to keep interactions strictly professional, but Min-jae treated her resistance as a challenge rather than a boundary. Things escalated slowly in ways that were easy to dismiss individually, but overwhelming when combined. A hand brushing her arm in the hallway, a comment whispered instead of spoken aloud, a lingering presence when she was alone in shared spaces. Se-ren began adjusting her routines to avoid him, arriving early, leaving late, skipping breaks. She told herself that endurance was part of military life. Complaining felt like weakness. She did not want to be labeled difficult. The incident that shattered her sense of safety happened during an informal gathering organized by senior staff. Attendance was not officially mandatory, but declining was clearly frowned upon. Food and alcohol were provided. Sae-Rin decided to stay briefly, planning to leave early. She did not drink. She kept her phone close. When one of the senior officers announced he was leaving and encouraged everyone to relax, Sae-Rin saw her chance. She gathered her things and headed toward the exit. That was when Min-jae stopped her. He said he was unwell, that he should not drive, that he needed help getting back to his quarters. His speech was unsteady, his posture sloppy. Sae-Rin hesitated. She did not want to be alone with him, but refusing could cause a scene, and leaving him to drive felt irresponsible. Against her instincts, she agreed, telling herself it would be a short drive, nothing more. It was not. What happened afterwards was something Sae-Rin would replay endlessly in her mind, searching for a moment she could have changed. The road was quiet. The car stopped where it should not have. Her protests were ignored. Her fear was dismissed. When it was over, she drove back to the base in silence, hands shaking on the steering wheel, mind fractured between disbelief and shame. She showered until her skin burned. She changed her clothes again and again. Sleep did not come. By morning, her resolve hardened. She refused to let the incident disappear into silence. She reported what happened to her immediate superior, Lieutenant Park, a man known for his polished demeanor and careful speech. He listened without interruption, nodding slowly, his expression grave. He told her she had done the right thing. He promised to escalate the matter. He assured her that the military took such accusations seriously. For the first time since the incident, Sae-Rin felt a small sense of relief. That relief did not last. Within hours, Min-jae knew she had reported him. He confronted her indirectly, sending messages that alternated between threats and mockery. He implied that no one would believe her. He suggested that rumors could reach her fiancé. When she returned to Lieutenant Park demanding an explanation, his tone had changed. The concern was gone. In its place was impatience. He asked her if she understood the consequences of making accusations without solid proof. He reminded her that reputations mattered. He suggested that misunderstandings happened, especially when alcohol was involved. When Sae-Rin insisted, his expression hardened. He told her calmly that pushing the issue could damage her career permanently. That was the moment she understood she was alone. Still, she refused to back down. She gathered what evidence she could. She submitted a formal complaint to the Internal Investigation Unit. The process was slow and grueling. She was questioned repeatedly, asked to recount details she wanted desperately to forget. Each interview felt less like a search for truth and more like a test of her endurance. Min-jae, meanwhile, continued his duties as usual. He was questioned once, briefly, and returned to work without restriction. Weeks passed. The investigation concluded quietly. The ruling stated that there was insufficient evidence to proceed. Min-jae was transferred to another unit. No charges were filed. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing was made. Sae-Rin received no apology, no support, no protection. The base became unbearable. Whispers followed her down corridors. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. She felt eyes on her everywhere, measuring, judging. Some colleagues avoided her entirely. Others looked at her with thinly veiled contempt, as if she had violated an unspoken rule by speaking out. When she requested temporary leave, citing health reasons, it was granted with visible reluctance. She returned to her fiancé, trying to act normal, trying to believe she could recover if she just rested long enough. But the calls did not stop. The pressure did not ease. She was reminded again and again that silence would have been easier. By the time her leave ended, Se-Rin was no longer the woman who had arrived at the base with quiet confidence months earlier. She returned because she felt she had no other choice. She believed that enduring was the only way forward. She did not yet know how much more the system would demand from her. She returned to the base under a gray morning sky, the kind that made time feel suspended. The guard at the gate checked her identification without looking at her face. That small detail stayed with her longer than it should have. During her leave, Se-Rin had rehearsed this moment in her mind, telling herself that walking back through the gate would feel like reclaiming control. Instead, it felt like stepping into a place that had already decided who she was allowed to be. Her reassignment notice was waiting on her desk. No explanation, no consultation. She had been transferred to a different operations unit within the same command, a move that sounded neutral on paper but functioned as isolation in practice. New faces, new supervisors, old rumors. She sensed immediately that people already knew her story, or at least a distorted version of it. When she introduced herself, responses were polite but guarded. Questions stopped just short of being questions. The work itself was familiar, but the atmosphere was not. She was excluded from informal briefings, training schedules changed without notice, requests for clarification were met with impatience. When mistakes happened, hers were recorded meticulously, while others were brushed aside. Se-Rin began to doubt her own competence. She had always trusted her ability to perform under pressure, but now even routine tasks felt heavier, as if every action was being weighed for confirmation of a narrative she had never agreed to. She tried to speak up again, this time not about the incident itself, but about the retaliation that followed. The response was always the same: vague reassurances, reminders to focus on her duties, suggestions that she might be over-interpreting normal workplace stress. One officer advised her to keep her head down for a while, to let things settle. Another warned her, quietly, that continuing to raise concerns would only make her situation worse. At night, she called her fiancé, Junho, and listened to his voice until it steadied her breathing. He noticed the changes she tried to hide. She was quieter. Her laughter sounded rehearsed. When he asked direct questions, she deflected, saying work was busy, that military life was harder than she expected. She wanted to protect him from the ugliness of it all. She also feared what would happen if he knew everything, not because she doubted his support, but because the institution had already taught her how easily truth could be twisted. The pressure intensified when Min-jae's name surfaced again, not directly, but as a shadow. She heard he had settled comfortably into his new assignment, that he was well liked, that the transfer had been described as routine. No one spoke of consequences. The message was clear. The system had absorbed the disruption and moved on. She was the only part that did not fit back into place. Her health began to suffer. Sleep came in fragments. Food lost its taste. During inspections, her hands shook slightly, enough that she clasped them behind her back to hide it. She requested counseling through official channels. The appointment was scheduled weeks out. When it finally happened, the session focused less on her experience and more on her ability to adapt. She was advised to practice resilience, to avoid dwelling on negative events, to consider how her attitude might influence her perception of the workplace. She walked out feeling smaller than she had going in. The wedding date approached quietly. It was supposed to be a turning point, a moment when life outside the base would take center stage. Se-Rin clung to that thought. She focused on small preparations, choosing a simple dress, confirming reservations, imagining a future that existed beyond uniformed corridors and locked doors. Junho noticed that when she talked about the wedding, her voice softened. It was the only topic that seemed to bring genuine warmth back into her eyes. On the day itself, everything unfolded with careful normalcy. They shared a modest ceremony attended by family and a few close friends. Se-Rin smiled for photos. She accepted congratulations. She thanked people for coming. Those who did not know her well would have seen nothing unusual. Those who did might have noticed how tightly she held Junho's hand, as if grounding herself through touch. That evening, they ate dinner together at a small restaurant they both loved, one they had visited during happier times. They talked about mundane things. Junho mentioned an upcoming shift he couldn't miss. Saerin listened, nodded, asked questions. She did not bring up work. She did not bring up fear. She did not bring up the weight pressing against her chest. She wanted this night to remain intact, unbroken by the shadows she carried. After dinner, she drove him to his workplace. He kissed her forehead before getting out of the car, telling her he would see her in the morning. She watched him walk away until he disappeared through the doors. Only then did her smile fade. At home, she moved through the apartment with deliberate care. She prepared food for the next day, placing it neatly in the refrigerator. She cleaned surfaces that were already clean. She straightened objects that did not need straightening. Each action felt like a way of organizing chaos, of asserting control in a world that had denied it to her. Before sitting down, she sent Junho a familiar message, the kind she had sent countless times before. Simple, ordinary, unremarkable. Then she recorded a video. In it, she did not shout or cry. Her voice was steady, almost calm. She spoke about duty and trust, about reporting wrongdoing and being punished for it, about following procedures and being abandoned at every step. She named no one directly, but the truth was unmistakable. She spoke about the loneliness of being disbelieved, about how isolation can erode even the strongest sense of self. She ended by apologizing to those she loved, not for what she had endured, but for the pain she knew they would feel. The next morning, Junho returned home, expecting nothing more than fatigue and routine. What he found instead fractured his understanding of the world. He called her family first, then emergency services. The apartment was quiet, untouched, as if time had paused out of respect. Beside her was her phone, the screen still lit. The video did not remain private long. When Saerwin's family saw it, grief turned quickly to resolve. Her father, a man who had always believed in institutions and order, felt something in him shift permanently. He realized that silence would make him complicit in the same system that had failed his daughter. Within days, he filed a formal petition demanding a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death. He attached the video. He attached records. He refused to let the matter be dismissed as a personal tragedy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The petition spread across social media, then news outlets. People who had never heard Saerin's name watched her final words and recognized patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar. Within 48 hours, hundreds of thousands had signed in support. Candlelight vigils formed outside government buildings. Former service members came forward with stories of their own, stories they had buried for years. Under public pressure, the Defense Ministry announced a renewed investigation. This time, it moved quickly. Min-jae was detained. Evidence that had once been deemed insufficient was suddenly re-examined with urgency. Witnesses who had previously stayed silent found their courage. During questioning, Min-jae confessed not only to what he had done to Saerin, but to prior misconduct that had been ignored or concealed. The trial was public. The sentence, when it came, was severe by institutional standards, though many felt it could never match the cost of what was taken. More significant, however, was what followed. Senior officers who had obstructed the original investigation were forced to resign. Internal documents revealed a pattern of deliberate suppression, of prioritizing reputation over responsibility. A high-ranking official addressed the nation, issuing an apology that acknowledged systemic failure. For the first time, change felt possible, even if it came too late. Saerin's name became a symbol, not of weakness, but of courage. Policies were reviewed, reporting mechanisms were restructured, training protocols were rewritten. None of it brought her back. None of it erased the quiet moments her family now lived with every day. But it disrupted a silence that had protected harm for too long. Junho kept the apartment much as it was. He watched the video only once. After that, he focused on remembering her as she had been before the uniform, before the system, before everything fell apart. A woman who believed in service, a woman who trusted that doing the right thing mattered. Her story did not end with her. It moved through courtrooms, through protests, through whispered conversations in places that once demanded obedience above all else. It became a reminder that institutions are made of people, and that when people choose silence, the cost is measured in lives. And though she never lived to see it, the truth she refused to bury reshaped the world she left behind. The days that followed unfolded in a strange, suspended rhythm. News of Ciarin's death moved faster than her family could process their grief. What began as a brief official notice quickly became something larger, pulled into public view by the video she had left behind. It was shared quietly at first, passed from one phone to another, then amplified by journalists who recognized its weight. People did not argue about what they saw. They listened. Her parents traveled to the capital carrying little more than documents and determination. They were not accustomed to cameras or microphones, yet suddenly they were surrounded by both. Ciarin's father spoke carefully, choosing words that honored his daughter without sensationalizing her pain. He said she had believed in fairness. He said she had trusted procedure. He said she had been failed by people whose duty was to protect those under their command. Public response was swift. Vigils appeared outside military headquarters and government offices. Candles lined sidewalks. Notes handwritten by strangers thanked Ciarin for her courage and apologized for a system that had not changed sooner. Former service members began to speak openly, some for the first time, about experiences they had been taught to minimize or forget. The pattern was unmistakable. What had happened to Ciarin was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. Under mounting pressure, the Defense Ministry announced an independent inquiry. This time, it did not stay behind closed doors. External prosecutors were appointed. Timelines were reconstructed using phone records, internal messages, and archived reports that had once been quietly filed away. The reassignment orders, the delayed responses, the missing follow-ups all painted a picture of intentional neglect. Minjae was formally charged. During questioning, the confidence he once carried dissolved. Faced with evidence and witness testimony, he admitted to actions he had previously denied. More damning still was what investigators uncovered beyond his confession. Senior officers had received reports and chosen inaction. Others had pressured subordinates to remain silent. Notes marked resolved without resolution surfaced, each one a small betrayal that added up to something devastating. The trial drew national attention. Ciarin's family attended every session. Her mother clutched a photograph taken years earlier, before uniforms and rank insignia had come to define her daughter's life. When the verdict was delivered, it was firm. The sentence reflected not only individual guilt, but acknowledgement of broader responsibility. It did not bring relief so much as validation. The truth had been spoken in a place where it could no longer be ignored. Accountability did not stop there. Several commanding officers resigned or were dismissed following disciplinary reviews. A high-ranking official addressed the public, admitting systemic failure and offering an apology that named responsibility rather than deflecting it. For many watching, it was the first time such words had been spoken without qualification. Reforms followed, though not without skepticism. Reporting mechanisms were revised to allow for external oversight. Mandatory response timelines were established. Training programs were rewritten to emphasize accountability rather than reputation management. Independent advocates were assigned to cases involving misconduct, ensuring that no one would have to navigate the process alone. Critics argued these changes should have come decades earlier. Supporters insisted they were still necessary. Junho stayed mostly out of the public eye. He declined interviews and returned quietly to his work. Grief, for him, was private. He visited Ciarin's resting place often, bringing small things she loved. He spoke to her about ordinary days, about weather and traffic and meals he learned to cook because she had liked them. In time, he found purpose in speaking to younger service members off the record, encouraging them to document everything, to trust their instincts, to know that silence was never the price of belonging. Searin's name became part of the national conversation, invoked in debates about reform and responsibility. Some worried it would fade into a symbol stripped of its human core. Her family resisted that. They shared stories of her childhood, her stubbornness, her laughter, her belief that service could be honorable if guided by integrity. They reminded people that she had not sought to be remembered this way. She had sought fairness. Years later, recruits would learn about policy changes without knowing the full story behind them. Others would know it by heart. For those who did, Searin represented a line that could not be crossed again without consequence. Her case altered procedures, yes, but it also shifted expectations. Leaders were watched more closely. Silence became harder to justify. The cost of that change remained heavy. No reform could replace a daughter, a partner, a friend. Yet in the quiet moments, her family found solace in knowing that her voice had carried farther than she ever imagined. She had spoken when it was hardest to do so, and in that act, she had forced a reckoning. Searin did not live to see the outcome of the fight she began, but the truth she refused to bury reshaped the institution that had tried to outlast her. And in that legacy, there was meaning, not closure, not peace, but purpose. On the evening of October 25, 1994, a young woman named Laura Bennett stood beneath the glare of television lights in the small town of Pine Ridge, North Carolina, begging the country to help her find her children. Her voice trembled as she spoke, hands clenched together as if holding herself upright through sheer will. She said she could not put into words how desperately she wanted her boys back, how empty her life felt without them, how much their family loved them. Beside her stood Mark Bennett, the children's father. He looked exhausted and stunned, but steady, repeating his plea to anyone watching to keep searching, to keep praying, to stay alert for any sign of the missing boys. Laura told police a terrifying story. She said she had been stopped at a red light near the edge of town when a stranger approached her car. According to her account, a man she described only in vague terms opened the driver's side door, pressed a gun against her side, and ordered her to drive. She claimed she obeyed out of fear for her life, her two sons crying in the back seat as the man barked directions. After driving for some time along dark rural roads, she said the man forced her to stop, shoved her out of the car, and drove away with her children still strapped into their car seats. Her sons, Ethan, age 3, and Caleb, just over a year old, vanished into the night. Laura said she ran toward the nearest house she could see, pounding on the door in a panic. The homeowner called emergency services, and within minutes, police cars flooded the area. Officers took Laura's statement, radioed in descriptions, and began what would quickly become a massive search. Roadblocks went up across the county, patrol cars scoured highways and back roads. Deputies knocked on doors and questioned anyone who might have been awake that late. By morning, the case had spread far beyond Pine Ridge. Photos of Ethan and Caleb appeared on television screens across the country. News anchors described the alleged carjacking and urged viewers to be on the lookout for Laura's missing sedan. Volunteers poured into town to help search. Churches opened their doors to organize prayer vigils. Local businesses donated food and supplies to search teams. It seemed as though an entire nation had rallied behind one grieving mother. For days, the search intensified. Officers combed wooded areas and drainage ditches. Dive teams checked nearby ponds and reservoirs. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning roads and fields for any trace of the car or the boys. Tips flooded in from across the region, each one followed up, each one leading nowhere. No one had seen the alleged carjacking. No one recalled a woman being forced from her vehicle. No traffic cameras captured the incident Laura described. Laura remained at the center of the coverage. She appeared on television repeatedly, pleading for her son's safe return. Her face became instantly recognizable, an image of maternal anguish replayed on a loop. At times, she sobbed openly, clutching Mark's arm. Other times, she spoke with an eerie calm, her words measured, her posture composed. Mark, meanwhile, stayed by her side, defending her against any hint of doubt and insisting she had been through enough already. Behind the scenes, however, investigators were beginning to feel uneasy. Some of Laura's details did not sit right. The intersection where she claimed to have been stopped did not function the way she described late at night. The timeline she gave seemed oddly stretched, and when detectives retraced her supposed route, they found no witnesses and no physical evidence to support her account. There were no skid marks where she said the car sped away, no footprints where she claimed she had been forced out. Officers also noticed Laura's behavior away from the cameras. When she believed no one was watching, her demeanor shifted. She laughed at jokes. She chatted casually with acquaintances. One detective noted how quickly she could move from visible distress to an almost detached calm. It was not how most parents of missing children behaved, especially in the early, terrifying days when every minute felt unbearable. Another thing stood out. Laura rarely asked questions. She did not press detectives for updates or demand to know what areas had been searched. She did not seem consumed by the details of the investigation. Instead, she waited for officers to approach her. When they did, she answered, but without urgency. To seasoned investigators, it felt wrong. By the third day, the focus quietly shifted. Publicly, authorities continued to search for a kidnapper. Privately, they began scrutinizing Laura's story more closely. Detectives asked her to recount the events again, this time slowly, step by step. Each retelling introduced subtle changes. The length of time she said she had driven changed. The direction she claimed she had faced at the light shifted. The way she described being pushed from the car grew less specific. They asked about injuries. She had none. No bruises, no scrapes, nothing consistent with a struggle. When asked why, she could not explain. Investigators requested that she take a polygraph test. Laura agreed. She failed. She agreed to a second test. She failed that one too. Though the results could not be used in court, they deepened the investigators' suspicions. As days passed, whispers began to circulate. Some of the inconsistencies leaked to the media. The public mood shifted from sympathy to confusion, then to doubt. Mark tried to reassure Laura, telling her the stress was causing the results, that grief could make anyone appear inconsistent. But even he began to notice something unsettling. Laura seemed more concerned about how she was being perceived than with where her children might be. 9 days after Ethan and Caleb vanished, investigators called Laura in for another interview. That morning, she and Mark sat for what would become their final television appearance. Laura repeated her plea, her voice cracking at familiar points, her eyes dry. Hours later, she sat across from Sheriff Thomas, a man who had known her family for years and who spoke to her with a mix of authority and sorrow. Sheriff Reed told Laura plainly that her story did not add up. He explained that officers had been stationed near the intersection she described that night for unrelated surveillance and had seen no carjacking. He pointed out the contradictions in her statements. He told her that her account had stirred fear and resentment in the community and that the truth could not remain hidden. Laura's composure crumbled. She bowed her head and began to cry, apologizing over and over. She spoke of feeling alone, overwhelmed, and trapped by her own life. She asked Reed to pray with her. When the prayer ended, she whispered that she could not carry the lie any longer. What she admitted next would change everything. She told investigators that the kidnapping had never happened, that no stranger had approached her car, that the story she had told the world was a desperate fabrication. She began writing a confession, her handwriting careful and deliberate. In it, she described driving aimlessly that night, consumed by despair, stopping near a remote body of water just outside town. She wrote about hesitation, about stopping and starting, about a final moment when she let go. As she finished writing, the frantic search that had gripped the nation took on a horrifying new direction. Dive teams were dispatched to the lake she mentioned. Sonar equipment swept the dark water. Within hours, they found what they were looking for. The lake lay quiet under a gray sky as law enforcement sealed off the shoreline. By the time the first divers entered the water, word had already begun to spread through Pine Ridge that the investigation had taken a grim turn. Reporters gathered at a distance, cameras trained on the still surface, while volunteers who had spent days searching now stood in stunned silence. The confession Laura Bennett had given only hours earlier hung heavily over the scene, reshaping every prayer and every hope that had carried the town through the past week. It did not take long for divers to locate the vehicle. Submerged near the far edge of the lake, partially hidden by murky water and overgrowth, it confirmed what many had feared since Laura broke down in the sheriff's office. The car was carefully brought up and secured as evidence. Authorities worked with quiet efficiency, their movements deliberate, respectful, and somber. No details were released immediately, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. Sheriff Thomas Reed addressed the public later that evening. His voice was steady but heavy with grief as he confirmed that the search for Ethan and Caleb was over. He spoke of the unimaginable loss and asked for privacy for the children's family, even as he acknowledged the community's pain. The town that had united in hope now shared a collective heartbreak. Laura was taken into custody that same night. She did not resist. She appeared calm, almost detached, as officers escorted her from the building. Mark Bennett was not present. When reached by investigators later, he was reportedly inconsolable, struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with the truth that had emerged. Friends described him as shattered, a man whose world had collapsed in on itself in a matter of hours. As the investigation moved forward, detectives worked to piece together Laura's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the incident. Interviews with family members, friends, and neighbors painted a complex and troubling picture. Laura had been under significant emotional strain. She spoke often of feeling overwhelmed, of believing she was failing as a mother, of feeling trapped by expectations she could not meet. Some recalled her expressing fear about the future, about finances, about her marriage. Others remembered her as attentive and devoted, making the contrast all the more difficult to understand. Investigators uncovered evidence that Laura had researched local lakes and remote areas in the days before the disappearance. She had visited the spot once before, telling Mark she needed time alone to think. At the time, no one questioned it. In hindsight, it took on a far more troubling meaning. The false kidnapping story, authorities concluded, was carefully constructed to redirect suspicion and buy time. She had rehearsed key details, choosing an intersection that sounded plausible, inventing a stranger who could never be found. What she did not anticipate was the scale of the response and the scrutiny that would follow. Each interview tightened the net, each inconsistency pulling the truth closer to the surface. Public reaction was swift and intense. The same nation that had watched Laura plead for her children now struggled to process the betrayal. Many felt anger, others disbelief. Some tried to understand how a mother could do such a thing, while others rejected the very idea that it could ever be explained. Vigils turned somber, their candles no longer symbols of hope but of mourning. Mental health professionals weighed in as the story dominated headlines. They spoke carefully about postpartum depression, chronic stress, and untreated mental illness, emphasizing that while such factors could help explain behavior, they did not excuse it. The conversation became broader, touching on the pressures placed on parents, the stigma around seeking help, and the warning signs that are often overlooked until it is too late. Laura was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During her initial court appearance, she remained largely expressionless, answering questions in a quiet voice. The judge ordered a psychological evaluation, and she was held without bail. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered while members of the community stood together, many holding photographs of Ethan and Caleb, their faces frozen in the smiles that had once inspired a nationwide search. As the case prepared for trial, prosecutors laid out their strategy. They planned to show intent, pointing to Laura's preparations, her research, and the deliberate nature of her actions afterward. The defense signaled that they would focus heavily on her mental state, arguing that she had been suffering from severe emotional distress that impaired her judgment. It was clear that the trial would force the court to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, illness, and accountability. Mark Bennett filed for divorce while the legal process unfolded. In a brief statement released through his attorney, he expressed his grief for his sons and asked for privacy as he tried to rebuild his life. Friends said he rarely spoke, spending his days moving between therapy appointments and long walks, searching for some way to live with what had happened. The trial began months later, drawing national attention once again to Pine Ridge. Jurors listened as investigators described the search, the confession, and the evidence recovered from the lake. Witnesses testified about Laura's behavior in the days leading up to the incident, her shifting stories, and her eventual admission. The defense called mental health experts who described severe depression and emotional instability, urging the jury to consider compassion alongside justice. Throughout the proceedings, Laura showed little visible emotion. At times she stared straight ahead, at others she kept her eyes downcast. When photographs of her children were shown, she closed her eyes but did not cry. The courtroom remained hushed, the weight of the testimony pressing down on everyone present. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for days, carefully reviewing evidence and instructions. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Laura Bennett was found guilty on both counts. The sentencing phase was brief but deeply emotional. Family members spoke of Ethan and Caleb, of the joy they brought, of the futures they would never have. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the case, but emphasized the irreversible harm caused. Laura was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, Pine Ridge slowly began to heal, though the scars remained. The lake where the car was found became a place few wanted to visit. A memorial was erected near the town square, bearing the names of the 2 boys and serving as a quiet reminder of the lives lost. The case left behind more questions than answers. Could someone have intervened earlier? Were there signs that went unnoticed? What responsibility does a community have to look after those who are struggling, even when they appear strong on the surface? These questions lingered, debated in living rooms, classrooms, and town meetings long after the headlines faded. For many, the story of Ethan and Caleb became a cautionary tale, not only about deception and tragedy, but about the importance of recognizing emotional distress and taking it seriously. It was a story of profound loss, of a community united first by hope and then by grief, and of a truth that proved far more devastating than any lie. Years passed, but Pine Ridge never fully returned to what it had been before. Time softened the sharpest edges of grief, Yet the absence left behind by Ethan and Caleb remained woven into the town's daily life. People still spoke their names carefully, as if saying them too loudly might reopen a wound that had never completely healed. The trial's conclusion brought legal closure, but emotionally nothing felt finished. For many residents, the hardest part was learning how to live alongside the memory. The memorial near the town square became a quiet gathering place. On ordinary days, it stood undisturbed, flowers fading gently in the sun. On anniversaries, candles appeared again, arranged by hands that still trembled with sorrow. Mark Bennett eventually left Pine Ridge. The house where laughter once echoed had become unbearable. Friends understood his decision, even if it felt like another goodbye layered onto many others. He moved closer to his sister, far from the lake, far from the roads where search teams had once marched with hope in their eyes. In rare moments when he spoke publicly, his words were simple. He asked people to remember his sons for who they were, not for how they died. Laura Bennett disappeared into the prison system, her name slowly fading from headlines. Psychological evaluations continued long after sentencing, their conclusions sealed in reports few would ever read. To the public, she became a symbol of something unthinkable. To professionals, she became a case study discussed in quiet rooms in academic journals. But to Pine Ridge, she was a reminder of how close tragedy can live to ordinary life. The case triggered changes beyond the town itself. State legislators cited it while debating expanded access to mental health resources, particularly for parents and caregivers. Funding was approved for crisis intervention programs and community-based counseling. While no reform could undo what had happened, many hoped it might prevent another family from breaking in the same way. Schools incorporated new training for teachers, focusing on recognizing signs of emotional distress in both students and parents. Counselors spoke openly with families, encouraging conversations that once felt uncomfortable or unnecessary. Slowly, the silence that had once surrounded mental health began to thin. Still, progress did not erase the pain. Every year, when spring returned and the lake thawed, some residents felt a familiar heaviness settle in their chest. The water looked peaceful again, giving no hint of what it had concealed. Nature, indifferent and unchanged, continued forward while people struggled to do the same. Among the search volunteers, bonds formed during those frantic days endured. They met occasionally, not to relive the tragedy, but to remind one another that compassion and unity still mattered. Many said the experience changed how they viewed their neighbors. They checked in more often. They listened more closely. They learned that someone smiling at the grocery store might still be fighting a quiet battle. The media eventually moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. But in Pine Ridge, the story never truly ended. It lived in small moments, in the empty seats at school events, in the toys donated anonymously to local shelters, in the way parents held their children a little longer before bedtime. What haunted many was not just what Laura had done, but how convincingly she had played the role of a desperate, loving mother searching for her children. It forced people to confront an unsettling truth. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, speaks in a calm voice, and stands beside you asking for help. Yet the story was not only one of deception and loss. It was also a story of a community that came together without hesitation. Thousands searched fields and roads. Strangers donated time, money, and resources. People who had never spoken before stood shoulder to shoulder, united by hope, then by grief. That unity did not disappear even when the outcome shattered them. In time, Pine Ridge learned to carry its history rather than run from it. The town added a small plaque near the memorial, not with details of the crime, but with a message about compassion, awareness, and the importance of asking for help. It was a quiet promise to do better, to notice more, to care deeper. No one ever claimed the tragedy had a single lesson or a simple explanation. Human lives rarely fit into neat conclusions. But for those who lived through it, the story became a reminder that pain ignored can grow dangerous, that appearances can deceive, and that community matters most when things fall apart. Ethan and Caleb were remembered not as victims of a crime, but as two bright lives that briefly touched many others. Their names were spoken at school assemblies, community walks, and charity events, not with fear, but with love. In remembering them this way, Pine Ridge found a fragile sense of peace. The town moved forward slowly and imperfectly, carrying both grief and resolve. And though the lake remained still, reflecting the sky without revealing its past, the people around it chose to remember, to learn, and to hold one another closer, determined that from unimaginable loss, something human and hopeful might still endure.